Good morning. My name is Missy Dominguez. My pronouns are she, her. Our opening words this morning come from Catherine May, Winter as Crucible. The changes that take place in winter are a kind of alchemy, an enchantment performed by ordinary creatures to survive. Plants and animals don't fight the winter. They don't pretend it's not happening and attempt to carry on living the same lives that they lived in the summer. They prepare, they adapt, they perform extraordinary acts of metamorphosis to get them through. Winter is a time of withdrawing from the world, maximizing scant resources, carrying out acts of brutal efficiency, and vanishing from sight. But that's where the transformation occurs. Winter is not the death of the life cycle, but its crucible.
I'm wondering if anyone would like to open our Wonder Box today. Oh my, would you look at this? What is this? It's a little turtle. Oh my gosh, it even has a little handhold in it. It's good, my hand's cold. Does anyone know what it's a puppet, yes. This reminds me of something we're talking about today, which with the older adult, with the adults, and you might be learning a little bit about in different ways, is about kindness. Kindness. And today, this reminds me of a story about a little boy who was about, let's say, 4 or 5 years old. Any 4 or 5-year-olds here? Or 5-year-olds? Okay, great, excellent. So you might learn something from this. It's about a little boy and a turtle. And one day there was this little boy, his name was Theodore. Can you say Theodore? Theodore. And his last name was Parker. Theodore Parker. And there's this little turtle, and Theodore Parker was out with his friends, and they came upon a little creek. And there was this little turtle going across the creek. And would you know what? His friends, Theodore Parker's friends, I hope you might have friends like this, but there was this little turtle crossing the creek, and one of his friends picked up a stick. And this little 4 or 5-year-old little gang of friends, one of the boys, it was a boy, wanted to see what would happen if he hit the turtle. Now, you would never hit a turtle with a stick, right? Okay, that was a nod. I think that means yes, I would not. And Theodore Parker just sort of stood back and didn't really know what to do. And the story doesn't actually say whether the boys hit the turtle or not, but the story does go on to say that Theodore Parker went home. And you know who he talked to when he got home? His mom. And sometimes moms can help put things into perspective. And so he was home. No, there's no turtle at this part of the story. He was home with his mom, and he told the story to his mom, and he was very sad. And his mom said, "What did you think should happen in that moment? What did you think should happen?" And Theodore said, I don't think the turtle should get hit with the stick. Do you agree? Yes. Okay, good. There's agreement there. And Theodore's mom said, "Well, how do you know that?" And he said, "Well, I just felt that. It felt like it, like where? Where did you feel that?" And he went kind of like kind of here. Have you ever felt something like that? Like maybe it's here, maybe a little like in your stomach. That's not right. And you know what the mom said? She said, "Yes, Theodore, that is your," it's a big word, "conscience." Have you heard that word? Conscience? That is your moral compass, she told young Theodore. And you need to listen to it, because when you listen to your conscience, it tells you something that isn't based in experience, but based in a deep, abiding truth, a deep knowing. The more you listen to your conscience, the less harm you will do in this world, the kinder you will be, the more loving you will be, and the less you will fall off your path. As a 4 or 5-year-old, that was a lot for him to digest, but it really became a central story in this young boy's life. And Theodore Parker went on to be one of the most influential Unitarian ministers. It's like me, but more influential. In the 1800s, really ever since, because he started to put forward this idea of conscience as as something that helps us decide what is right and wrong. And we'll talk more about that with adults. But ultimately, what we are trying to do here is, before we act, whether on the playground, in our families, at holiday celebrations, in encounters with people you don't see all the time, is to try to step back and think deeply, feel deeply, really. What is the right thing for me to do here? What is my conscience telling me? And perhaps that can guide you towards more kindness, more love, and perhaps a better life for all, okay? Okay. We're going to send our young ones and not so young ones off to their classes this morning. And will you sing with me now?
When I first discovered the UU Church, after a lifetime of religious manipulation, I was so relieved to find a genuinely loving and accepting congregation that I never stopped to question the church's history. I joined the church under the assumption that the breadth of its history was maybe a group of free spirits in the 60s with a dream. Obviously, this perception didn't bother me, because here I am, a proud member, fellow hippie. I'm happy to say that I've since learned that the history here is drastically more significant and long-lived than I had originally thought. The origin story of the UU Church is filled with compassionate visionaries who fought against popular thought patterns in their own eras. Today, you will learn about only one of them, but there are so many more to explore, and thankfully, many of their writings survive today. I guess some people might feel foolish for making assumptions that turned out to be wildly untrue, but I'm glad to be proven wrong. I am comforted to know that there is a rich history here. The fact that we have history means that we are not the first humans, or even the first Americans, to look around and say, this isn't right, and I want to change it. The early predecessors of the UU Church have existed for hundreds of years, and the ideas that they wrote about existed long before them. The Unitarian Universalist Association may have formed in 1961, so I was actually a little bit right about the hippies. But the movements that produced the UUA are far older. The first official Unitarian Church was formed in 1774, while the idea of Universalism emerged shortly after the death of Jesus of Nazareth. We've been through tough times before with our humanity intact, and we will do so again. I don't have a time machine, and I'm no expert in human evolution, but I have a feeling that us bleeding hearts have always been here. I bet even the cavemen had a few tree huggers who kept bringing furry little rescues back to the cave. and that's okay. The history books often don't do a great job of documenting people like us, but we have always been here. Our belief that every human life is sacred and true peace is possible is not new, and that comforts me greatly. There's a deep feeling of dread for a lot of people right now, a fear of what they see coming and feel powerless to stop. But none of us are an army of one. You're not the only one panicking. You're not the only one who's scared. And we are not the first generation to face these threats. We have a millennia of compassionate ancestors behind us. To know that there have always been people standing in opposition to war, to genocide, to fascism, to slavery, at all the darkest points of human history, gives me hope. It's a hope that there are far more of us than anyone realizes, and that our army is out there.
Well, today is a special day for me. Nick's sermon on Theodore Parker, my 75th birthday, and I'm sharing remarks about pledging. Often folks stand here and share about their experiences with UUCCI. I'm here for the same reasons, but with a little twist. I want to talk about growing up in Old South Union Congregational Church, a liberal New England church. From early as Sunday school, where my sister had my dad as a Sunday school teacher and I had my mother, which, you have to put up with things. They had to put up with us. I still remember the names of my other Sunday school teachers. We were a community. While in junior high, our church sponsored ballroom dance lessons. And while all of us knew how to twist, due to the twist, before the class started, we were taught the proper way to do the twist. And during those classroom sessions, Donna became my first girlfriend. We were a community. The church held variety shows similar to our cabarets. And my appearance in those shows with my ventriloquist dummy, Dickie, predated my appearances here with a moose. And just as we had annual markets and auctions, Old South had similar activities where as a kid, I would buy the wildest neckties possible. We were community. UUCCI is a community of hope and courage where we celebrate love and work for justice. Growing up, the senior minister of Old South participated in the 1963 March on Washington. I was co-editor of the senior high youth group's newsletter. My beat was the gossip column, but my co-editor and good friend wrote an editorial in 1966 in support of the Vietnam War. Our associate minister asked for a chance to offer rebuttal, and that led to a series of programs with us on war. Our minister of Christian education, yes, we had 3 ministers. He opened a teen center, a room for all teens from around the town could come, including some teens who might not normally be acceptable to middle-class America at that time, or maybe they wouldn't even be accepted today. And the minute that same minister took a number of us high school kids during Christmas break to New York City, where we experienced Night Court, not quite like the TV comedy series, but how others in society lived, and it was an eye-opener for me. We certainly were a community. At the time I grew up, I never realized the impact that Old South would have on me. And I doubt that all of the church pledgers, those members who pledged every year, understood how their financial support impacted my life and so many of my friends. On the website of Old South Today, a church that dates back to 1723, is something similar to my community today. And while the faith path I have taken may not quite be how it's preached in my old church, there's still a strong sense of community. For they say on their website, as we say at the start of all of our worship services, whoever you are, whomever you love, and wherever you are on life's journey, you are welcome here. Sounds pretty familiar. I grew up in a church community that has remained with me to this day. And I've been part of this community since I first walked into the 8th Street Church in 1985. Chris and I were married in that building. Our son was married in Missouri by a UU minister who, not surprisingly, Nick knows. In fact, I think Nick knows every UU minister in this country. Our daughter and her family attend and participate in the UUI community in Indy. What a great feeling it is to have your kids become UU adult members. Your financial and volunteer support can help make an impact within our community and in the broader community outside of these walls, and might likely have an impact on all of the kids who participate in our community today and those who will be entering our doors in the future. Your support today can help us make a better community for our kids and our grandkids' future. So if you haven't filled out the pledge form, please do so. Heck, do it as a birthday gift for me. And as Abraham Lincoln said, leave nothing for tomorrow which can be done today.
This morning's reading is an excerpt from The Transient and the Permanent in Christianity. To turn away from the disputes of the Catholics and the Protestants, of the Unitarian and the Trinitarian, of old school and new school, and come to the plain words of Jesus of Nazareth. Christianity is a simple thing, very simple. It is absolute, pure morality, absolute, pure religion, the love of man, the love of God, acting without let or hindrance. The only creed it lays down is the great truth which springs up spontaneous in the holy heart. There is a God. Its watchword is, be perfect as your Father in heaven. The only form it demands is a divine life, doing the best thing, in the best way, from the highest motives. Perfect obedience to the great law of God. Its sanction is the voice of God in your heart, the perpetual presence of Him who made us and the stars over our head, Christ and the Father abiding within us. All this is very simple. A little child can understand it. Very beautiful. The loftiest mind can find nothing so lovely. Try it by reason, conscience, and faith, things highest in man's nature. We see no redundance. We feel no deficiency. Examine the particular duties it enjoins: humility, reverence, sobriety, gentleness, charity, forgiveness, fortitude, resignation, faith, and active love. Try the whole extent of Christianity so well summed up in the command: Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, and with all thy soul, and with all thy mind. Thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. And is there anything therein that can perish?
About a week ago, I was speaking on the phone with Missy about the service we were planning for today, and to my gratitude, she expressed Not only her interest in the specific topic of the 19th century Unitarian minister and abolitionist Theodore Parker, but of Unitarian Universalist history in general. You see, as she noted in her reflection this morning, it is easy and common for the vast majority of you who became Unitarian Universalists as adults, you who join in the living tradition, the flowing stream of liberal and liberating religion, to merely look forward at the journey ahead, rather than backwards at the rich history upstream from whence the waters in which we now wade once came. Yes, to her and my perpetual gladness, Unitarian Universalism is a part of the large flowing aqualogical system of life, to those rivers and seas, streams and creeks, those watersheds and deep basins, lakes and ponds, indeed to all the tributaries of these nourishing waters of our common life. We don't merely seek to be shapers of history, as the late Reverend Dr. Gordon McKeeman encouraged us to be. Yes, we are not only shapers of history, but we are keepers of history as well. We are keepers of our living tradition that is passed over and down, forward and up, whichever way, to each new generation by age or arrival of those who enter, like you did once, into the loving embrace of Unitarian Universalism. And so here we are, keepers of history, shapers of history. But we must take up one more task if we are to claim these corresponding responsibilities. Any ideas? Yes. If we are to be keepers and shapers of history, we must surely be knowers of history in the first place. We must know our history if we are to bear it, carry it, if we are to keep the flame alive, let alone allow it to guide what paths we may take in this uncertain time we find ourselves today. So I am thankful this morning that Mark Kevitt chose a person and topic for generously bidding on the auction sermon, a person that is situated deeply within the heart of our Unitarian religious heritage. There are an infinite number, an innumerable number of limbs, branches, and leaves you could have chosen, but to my gratitude, you chose a person who lived at such a consequential time in both Unitarian and United States history. Indeed, one who was a shaper of both histories, the implications of which we may feel if we know where to look today. It cannot be overstated. Theodore Parker is one of the most impactful and transformative religious leaders in our living tradition. He lived and ministered at a time when a limb of the great tree of life was preparing to split into two branches in both our Unitarian and our United States history. In the very limited time I have this morning, I hope to speak to both critical eras in these interwoven histories that run approximately between 1840 and 1860, but with particular priority given to our Unitarian history, as it may help us to consider today some of the big questions and challenges we face in our country before us. So it is important to understand the time and place in which Theodore Parker lived and ministered. Born in Lexington, Massachusetts in 1810, he lived and came of age in a location that is the highest concentration of Unitarians in the United States. The greater Boston area is brimming. It's sort of like throw a stone or a loaf of bread or something less violent, and you'll hit a Unitarian or a Unitarian congregation or parish. When I was in 9th grade, I went on a UU history trip with my youth group, and also a very deeply influential growing up experience. and learned so much about our spiritual forebears in Boston. But despite being immersed in such history, Parker was not always destined to become a minister. In fact, he grew up with many anti-clerical sentiments that turned him off in many regards to organized religion for the most part. However, in time, he warmed to the idea, especially due to the growing belief that the position of minister and the profession of ministry, especially through the vehicle of preaching and writing and preaching and congregational life, can be sources of great social transformation. You see, Parker was deeply committed to the betterment of society, which went hand in hand with the betterment of the individual, of the sharpening of the mind, the opening of the heart to greater affection for one's neighbor, and the nourishing of the soul and one's religious convictions. Parker also came of age in the aftermath of three significant events, including the founding of Harvard Divinity School in 1816, followed by William Ellery Channing's most famous articulation of the character and definition of Unitarian Christianity in 1819, and finally, the creation of the UUA's predecessor organization, the American Unitarian Association, in 1825. All of this led eventually to his enrollment at Harvard in 1834 for his formal preparation for the Unitarian ministry. Yet a lot would still unfold in the years prior to Parker's seminal work, which was excerpted today in our reading and to which this sermon title alludes. Theodore Parker was at Harvard Divinity School from 1834 to 1837. And during this time, he came across this interesting person, the writings and ministry of one Ralph Waldo Emerson. Most notably, his 1836 publication of arguably Emerson's most famous and controversial work titled Nature. A brief but important aside, Nature, for all intents and purposes, marked the birth of what became known as Transcendentalism. And Transcendentalism and the Transcendentalists represented the second major American religious controversy that the Unitarians were involved in. We love controversy. But Nature really took Boston and the liberal religious world by storm. And then the storm got bigger. In 1838, just a year after Parker graduated from HDS, the commencement speaker was none other than, you guessed it, Ralph Waldo Emerson. It was at this ceremonial send-off to new liberal clergy, all ready to take the world by storm, that the final catalyzing event shaped the context and history which ushered Parker into his ministry and activism in the months or in the years to come. And the era and import of this speech cannot be overstated. Known simply as the Divinity School Address, great title, Divinity School Address, Emerson outlined his criticism of Unitarianism, and boy, did he have a few. Less than 2 decades after Channing created a bold, strong statement that shone a bright light on the future of Unitarianism, Emerson brought a wet blanket to the party. And while great unpacking should be done for both Channing and Emerson's notable treatises, we do need to be getting to the star of the hour, Parker. In consolation, though, I would commend you the book, Three Prophets of Religious Liberalism, which includes all 3 of these primary texts and has an excellent introduction for context. Again, it's called Three Prophets of Religious Liberalism. In many regards, the transient and the permanent in Christianity best articulates the struggle between, on the one hand, the Unitarian establishment, still just recently freed from the Congregationalist orthodoxy of New England. That was our first controversy. And on the other hand, the renegade Transcendentalists, as embodied by Emerson, compared to Emerson's own often ecstatic, eclectic, and esoteric writing style. In fact, I think the essential value of Parker's contribution is found no deeper than in the title itself. For what Parker offered his contemporaries, and for all of us 183 years later, was a reminder and an encouragement to consider that the essence of something, including as big as Christianity or of Unitarian Universalism today, consists of both transient elements and permanent elements. On May 19th, 1841, at the ordination of the Reverend Charles C. Shackford, you know, these big sermons always happen at the ordination, and no one talks about the actual person that was getting ordained. But so shout out to Shackford. Theodore Parker outlines with at once careful precision and rhetorical simplicity what he sees as the transient or fleeting qualities of Christianity and those that are permanent, essential, or eternal to the religion. While Parker shared much of Emerson's criticism of Unitarianism, he was less prepared to throw the baby out with the bathwater. Parker still saw a central supremacy of the Christian narrative and didn't go as far as Emerson, who sought to decenter into a post-Christian, transcendent, universal spiritual worldview altogether. In short, the transient and the permanent in Christianity can be differentiated by what Parker saw as things that were original to the teachings of Jesus and to those that were later created and developed by humans. He deplored the divisions and petty fractures in his mind between the increasingly diversifying Protestant landscape. He saw the differences among the ecumenical community to be based more on cultural, practical, doctrinal, and ephemeral qualities that have no inherent value in and of themselves, compared to the essential, permanent, and eternal truth that Christianity espouses, which we heard some of today. And here's a little more. Parker writes, to turn away from the disputes of the Catholics and the Protestants, of the Unitarians and the Trinitarians, the old school and the new school, whatever that meant, and came to the plain words of Jesus of Nazareth, Christianity is a simple thing, very simple. It is absolute, pure morality, absolute, pure religion, the love of man, the love of God, acting without let or hindrance. The only creed it lays down, if any, is the great truth which springs up spontaneous in the holy heart. There is a God. The universalism Parker promotes here may feel like a minimization of difference or an oversimplification based on our experiences here living in the 21st century. But here is an interesting example of what separates the Transcendentalists and the Unitarians, and remains a dynamic in many ways that we face today. In an article titled The Political Ideas of Theodore Parker, Arthur Ledoux argues that Parker's interest and involvement in politics went hand in hand with his awakening to a transcendentalist worldview, that it really wasn't that active or involved prior to that. He was quoted as never really having a preference between, I think it was Harrison and Van Buren. Did they go against each other? Someone against each other. He was just he sat out. He wasn't really involved until he became transcendentalist. Parker writes, quote, according to Ledoux, Parker saw consciousness as superior to experience. Parker writes, quote, "He that is true to conscience, superior to experience." Parker writes, "He that is true to conscience, faithful to reason, obedient to religion, has not only the strength of his own virtue, but the whole strength of omnipotence on his side. Thus man partakes the divine nature. What is universal, absolute, true, speaks out of his lips." Parker writes elsewhere this: "In politics, transcendentalism starts not from experience alone, but from consciousness, not merely from human history, but also from human nature. It does not, there's that nature. It does not so much quote precedents, contingent facts of experiences as ideas, necessary facts of consciousness. It appeals to a natural justice, a natural right, absolute justice, absolute right." There we hear that allusion to Emerson and nature just a few years prior. So due to the orientation, this orientation, it is no surprise Parker became an adamant abolitionist, seeing human freedom as an absolute right and the institution of slavery as an absolute injustice. His teachings and preaching in the 1840s solidified this stance as the United States became increasingly divided, barreling perhaps inevitably toward a civil war. In 1850, the beginning of Parker's last decade of ministry in his young life, it represented a possible compromise solution in the form of the fugitive slave law. However, opponents of the legislation, including Parker, saw the writing on the wall. The issue had no compromise. It would not last. We would not last as a nation. Said differently, in the words of the newly nominated Republican candidate for U.S. Senate from Illinois, Abraham Lincoln, "A house divided cannot stand against itself, or a house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe this government cannot endure permanently, half slave, half free." Theodore Parker's ministry then in the 1850s included the co-founding of the Vigilance Committee in Boston. That's a nice name, the Vigilance Committee, to be in solidarity with quote, the colored inhabitants of Boston from any invasion of their rights, end quote. Most notably, the reabduction by officials from the South sent to retrieve what some falsely viewed as property. No, the Vigilance Committee was one of many radical acts of ministry and social justice engaged by Parker to resist the creep of complicity to and participation in the slavery industrial complex in the North. In response to one incident related to Ellen and William Craft, very interesting story, who escaped slavery and arrived after a treacherous journey to Boston in early 1849. After the officials were harassed and eventually gave up and went home due to the Vigilance Committee, Theodore Parker wrote a scathing letter to President Millard Fillmore, because he had nothing else to do but read it, the signer of the fugitive law, but who also happened to be a Unitarian. Fillmore was an apologist for slavery and hoped to compromise to endure the era of slavery until a resolution would just peacefully come. In a gripping image and rhetorical crescendo Parker was known for, he wrote in his letter to Fillmore, quote, "There hangs in my study the gun my grandfather fought with at the Battle of Lexington, and also the musket he captured from a British soldier on that day. If I would not peril my property, my liberty, nay, my life, to keep my parishioners out of slavery, then I should throw away these trophies." Parker lived with this life or death mentality. He was a workaholic, and it likely played a part in his early demise at just 50 years old. He once wrote in his journal in 1840, still at the beginning of his career, "I must do or die. I must do or die. Yet 20 years later, as he prepared to die, he was realistic. Having just relocated to Italy, he told his fellow Unitarian minister in a letter, George Ripley, quote, "I am conscious that I leave half my work undone. Much grain lies in my fields." Indeed, Parker would never experience the pain of the Civil War or the liberation from slavery that came following its conclusion, dying in 1860. Much debate surrounds whether Lincoln ever met Theodore Parker, but it is so evident that he was influenced by the progressive religious spirit who saw through the transient toward the permanent and essential truth and value of liberal religion. Parker's writing influenced not only President Abraham Lincoln, but also Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. a century later in the 20th century, and President Barack Obama in the 21st. All of this is to say the following. Theodore Parker deserves our deepest gratitude and our continued study. For in his writings, or even just proposing that some things in our religion or society are transient and other things are permanent, we are called to such rigorous consideration and action in our lives today. As individuals, families, as a congregation, a city, a region, as a state and nation, we are asked to get really serious, like deathly serious, and cut through the paraphernalia of life so that we may uplift the pure, the absolute, and glorious virtues and rights worthy of our steadfast celebration and commitment. As a congregation, when we talk about our mission or our vision of a strategic plan or objectives, this is not about getting corporate. It's about getting real, getting alive. It's about getting real, that we can either be a transient blip on the timeline of history or a permanent branch in the deviation from one road to another. That branch, that road we may journey, the less traveled one indeed, may prove to make all the difference in our lives and those we come to love in this life. Theodore Parker knew his history. He held it gently and chose to shape it toward a more righteous future where all could experience the beauty and joy of life. We too are here pointing toward the bicentennial of Parker's great ministry. We can and must convict ourselves to the work of furthering a mission and a vision worthy of our name, Unitarian Universalist. May we find such courage and conviction to make it so. Amen.